Welcome to today's episode of the College Investor Audio Show. I am super excited to have a special guest today. It is the Department of Education's Undersecretary, Nicholas Kent. He is the top policy federal official at the Department of Education. He oversees post-secondary education, career, technical, adult education, and the big one, the federal student aid portfolio. We are recording this at the beginning of June, and we are about a month away from some of the largest changes to student loan borrowing and student loan repayment that I've ever seen. And I've been doing this almost 20 years. And so I am super excited to introduce Undersecretary Kent here. And we're going to dive into a little bit of wonky, how we got here, but also a little bit of practical on what you need to know here in the coming months. So, Mr. Undersecretary, thanks so much for joining me here today.
Thanks, Robert. I appreciate being here. Long-time listener, first-time attendee here. So very excited to jump into what you aptly noted as some of the biggest changes in higher education in decades.
Yeah, I think there is a lot on both the borrowing side and the repayment side, and I think we're going to be able to cover both of them. But I know I have a lot of listeners that literally have no idea what an Undersecretary of Education is, what you do. And, one of the biggest things I've been fielding is what is how does our government work? I feel like it's how to write a bill, that video we watched in second grade over again. So give us a little down low on what you do and how you are implementing kind of what these changes are, what the changes are.
Yeah. So, Robert, I get that question a lot. What is the undersecretary? And I always like to bifurcate it into sort of two responses. What is the undersecretary and who is the undersecretary? Because I think the who really drives the what. What is the undersecretary? So at the Department of Education, if you kind of think about it divided into two, you have K through 12 and you have higher education. And the undersecretary is responsible for sort of the higher education portfolio. Well, what does that mean? Well, first and foremost, it means the Office of Federal Student Aid, which is responsible for the $1.7 trillion, yes, with the T, trillion-dollar loan portfolio. And it also includes the Office of Post-Secondary Education, which is like the entity within the department that's responsible for all the regulations that impact the federal student loan portfolio. Federal Student Aid is really an operations-based unit within the department. It doesn't really do policy. The policy is driven by the Office of Post-Secondary Education along with the Office of the Undersecretary. And then lastly, I'm responsible for the Office of Career and Technical Education as well. So it's a little bit smaller of an office than the other two, but critically important to the administration's agenda of championing career and technical education. So that is what is the Office of the Undersecretary. Now we turn to who is the Undersecretary. Well, I was a first-generation Pell Grant student. I was a low-income individual from rural West Virginia. I had a very challenging time in college. I had a family member, my mother, who passed away my junior year in college. I didn't have really the resources that I needed to persist, but with some help from financial aid professionals and working through college, I was able to get through my educational journey and graduate and go on to grad school. But I like to tell that story because, people who have previously sat in these positions have been people from privilege. They've graduated from Ivy League colleges. They haven't had the same types of challenges as I did, which is really the norm nowadays. The traditional college student is really those who are, first generation college students, military connected individuals, people who have undergone hardships. And I want people to recognize that the person who's sitting in the undersecretary role right now has undergone a lot of those challenges and really informs the work that we do. I think about a lot first-generation students. I think about students who don't have the resources. I think about the fact that too many college students can't afford higher education right now. I think about all of the various pathways that we want to champion for college students, knowing that we don't want to shoot shoehorn students to a 4-year degree, that we want to be able to make sure that people understand the various options that are available. So the undersecretary is somebody who takes all of that work into consideration and all of those factors when we create big federal policy that's going to impact over 40 million students and hundreds of millions of individuals throughout the country.
I think it's also important to put that context on this, that education isn't just four-year college. I do think I grew up at a day and age where it's everyone needs four-year college. This was like the motto that was like kind of drilled into my mind when I went to school. And you kind of framed it as education is a broad thing in this country. We do have K to 12, which is another role, but then you have the higher education side, which is 2-year, 4-year vocational, career, technical training, which I think are all pathways to hopefully unlock better lives for Americans, which I do think is fundamental here. But I think the system is very complicated. And we got to this system, and this is maybe a little bit of history we could talk about. Like, how did we get here? And how did the one big beautiful bill kind of change policy? And then I guess how to like think about is we do these policies with an end goal. So what does like the end goal in maybe 5 years look like from the changes you're trying to implement today?
You're 100% right, Robert. I think we probably grew up in the same generation where a 4-year degree was championed as the only pathway to economic and social success. And throughout the years, while maybe that was well intentioned when we were going to school or up and coming, the reality is that that's not true. And what we have done, unfortunately, is we've shoehorned millions of students into programs and colleges that weren't the best for them and their families. And so, again, I always like to underscore we're not saying that a 4-year degree doesn't have value. Certainly, it does have a lot of value for many students. But it is not the only pathway to success. And so we do want to be championing, short-term credentials, registered apprenticeships, career and technical education. We do want to highlight those and lift those up for students and families to understand that those are options that also bring economic and social success. How did we get here? I think that if you ask any honest policymaker, they will tell you that if they had to create a whole federal student loan system again or federal financial aid system again, they would not design it the way that it is currently designed today. Some people refer to it as a patchwork system. Some people even call it a Frankenstein. And the way that it has developed is political expediency over the years, where you have certain policymakers who want to add a repayment plan here or a repayment plan there. They want to add a federal financial aid system because they feel that a particular aid program is a good idea. And so we've gotten to a place where the federal financial aid system is really a patchwork that doesn't work together well. So one of the opportunities that we really have before us under the Working Families Tax Cuts Act is to simplify our federal student aid system. So how do we do that? One is that we are reducing the complex maze of repayment and discharge options. Right now, there are over 40 of them, and it's overly complex for most borrowers. We believe that whether you have a certificate in pipe fitting or you have a PhD in philosophy, you should be able to navigate the federal student aid system, especially when it comes time to take out a loan or to repay your loan. So we are reducing the number of options that are available, not because we think options are bad, but because they're too confusing. People do not understand the differences between these programs. And so starting on July 1, new borrowers who take out a loan after July 1 will really have access to two repayment plans, two new affordable repayment plans, the standard tiered standard plan and the repayment assistance plan. And we're very excited about both of those plans. At the same time, the Working Families Tax Cuts Act does other things in the higher education space. It stands up a new short-term Pell program where for the first time, we're going to be able to give access to, low and middle income students who want to participate in high value short term programs as short as 8 weeks. Again, this kind of goes with what I was saying before, is we want to give students more options, and this aid program is going to do that. At the same time, we're big about holding institutions accountable. In the last election, I think that people really had a mandate that they were tired of higher education saddling students with unmanageable debt. Many times these graduates are getting out of school and they don't have workforce aligned jobs. They're working at Starbucks, with a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. And so what we're also doing through this bill is holding programs accountable for providing some de minimis level of value to make sure that we're not subsidizing at the federal level programs that are actually not producing real value for graduates. So it's a lot in the bill, and we're going to have it all up and running by July 1st.
Let's go behind the scenes here and let's start on the repayment plan side of things, because I think there's repayment and there's borrowing, and it can get confusing when we overlap. But on the repayment plan side, we have Save winding down, we have the WRAP and the tiered standard plans launching, and you have a lot of borrowers and moving parts. So what has the department done to kind of ensure this transition is going to happen as smoothly as possible? Like, what does it look like with the loan servicers and technically, and what can borrowers expect here in almost 3 weeks coming up here?
Yeah. So not to rehash history, Robert, but just for your viewers or your listeners' knowledge, remember, SAVE was the Biden administration's sort of final opportunity or final go at broad student loan forgiveness. They had tried broad student loan forgiveness a different way several months earlier than the SAVE plan, and that was struck down by the Supreme Court, right? And so the Biden administration sort of took one more bite at the apple, and they tried broad student loan forgiveness through this SAVE plan, where the SAVE plan was so generous that millions of borrowers didn't even have to make payments, and would never have to make payments before forgiveness. That plan was challenged in federal court, and the Biden administration lost under that plan. And so, it's gone through the appeals process. Through the Trump administration, we entered into a settlement agreement with the state of Missouri to end that plan. So that plan is dead. And borrowers have to recognize that they need to move. And what we have done is started communicating with borrowers last summer that this plan was on its last leg. And then late last year, we notified borrowers that the plan had been deemed unlawful by the courts, and that we would be in touch with them soon, which we have been. Over the course of the spring and now the summer, we've done two campaigns from the Department of Education letting borrowers know that the SAVE plan is no longer an option, and that they need to soon transition to a new repayment plan. Now, what we have said is that starting on July 1, servicers will be reaching out to tranches of borrowers to notify that particular borrower when their 90-day clock starts and when it stops. And so borrowers will have 90 days at least from July 1st to pick a lawful repayment plan. Why July 1st, right? Robert, you might say, well, you've been talking to borrowers since last year and you've been emailing them since earlier this year. Like, what is so special about July 1st? Well, it's true. We've been notifying borrowers so that we give them as much time as possible to recognize that the SAVE plan really is dead and it's no longer an option. And borrowers today can move. They can move to a lawful repayment plan today if they want to. But we wanted to give them until July 1st because July 1st is that magic date when WRAP, the Repayment Assistance Plan, and the tiered standard plan are going to be available to borrowers. And so we thought it fair to give borrowers 90 days from the date that those plans are available. So if you had borrowers who really wanted to dig into the regulations or really understand the details behind the plans, we didn't want to force them into it sooner. And so every borrower will have, from July 1st, 90 days. And so the way that this will work, because I've been getting this question a lot, is that not all borrowers will be notified on July 1st. It will be tranched out. So you'll have some borrowers who are notified on July 1st, some borrowers who are notified 2 weeks later, some borrowers who are notified 2 weeks later after that. And every group of those borrowers will have 90 days. Why did we do that? Well, we want to make sure that we don't break anything, and we want to make sure that we support borrowers. The last thing that we want are, millions of borrowers calling their servicer on July 1 and not getting an answer or not getting good customer service. And so by tranching it out, it allows the servicers to be able to operationalize this to the greatest benefit of the borrowers. So, we have a lot of work to do to move these SAVE borrowers out. I am pleased to report that today we have over 300,000 SAVE borrowers who have moved since we started our campaigns. Again, we did a campaign earlier this spring. We did one in May. We're going to do another one this month. And then we're going to hand the work over to the servicers to be able to start notifying those borrowers.
I guess, is there a final deadline, though, that borrowers should expect to be wrapped up on? Because I do think there's some concern that what if I miss that 90-day notice? And myself in the media, like, I love to tell people a fixed date. I don't know if you have that answer, but if you have a fixed date, that would be phenomenal.
Yeah, what I would tell borrowers is to consider moving to a lawful repayment plan today. Consider moving to a lawful repayment plan on July 1st. If you're holding out for RAP or you're holding out for tiered standard, then hold off until July 1, but don't wait until July 2nd. There's no reason to wait. Like I said, every tranche of borrowers will have a separate deadline, right? So your borrower who gets notified on July 1 may have until October 1, right? Your borrower who gets notified on July 5th may have until, October 15th. This is the whole reason that we have been talking to borrowers since last year, is we want them to be well aware that this is coming. Their first notice is not going to be on July 1 saying, you have until October 1, you better move, right? They will have gotten multiple notices from us over the course of almost a year telling them that SAVE is ending and that, they need to be thinking about moving. And now, hey, now you've been thinking about it. Now here are some other new options that are available to you. So certainly my goal as the undersecretary, the secretary's goal, and the whole team here at the Department of Education is to make sure that we do support borrowers. But at the end of the day, these 7 million students have to leave SAFE. And listen, it's of benefit to them. They're not making progress towards reducing their balance. They're recognizing interest on their loans. They're not recognizing, time towards whatever discharge options that are available to them, including public service loan forgiveness. So they're not doing themselves a service by staying in SAVE right now. So they should either move today or move shortly after July 1st.
With that in mind, you have the RAP plan coming and the tiered standard plan coming. And there's been some pushback that these plans might be more expensive to borrowers than they had under the SAVE plan. What do you say to that? And who do you think fits into each plan? Like, what are the benefits of RAP, tiered standard, and how should a borrower think about that logistical financial decision?
Well, certainly, these plans could be more expensive than SAVE, but as I mentioned, SAVE was just broad student loan forgiveness for the most part, wrapped up in a different colored wrapping paper. And so the reality is that SAVE was unlawful. And the federal courts decided that, the department couldn't move forward with that. But we have these two new, really affordable options available. And I think it's not fair to compare these two options to the SAVE plan because that was an unlawful plan. So what does the RAP plan do? Well, it's a new income-driven repayment plan. It will be really the income-driven repayment plan that is available to borrowers who take out a loan after July 1st of 2026. And two of the key features is that it includes an interest subsidy as well as a principal matching payment. So what does that mean? Let me sort of synthesize it for your sort of average borrower or listener here, or your grandma who maybe doesn't really understand the nuances of how education financing works. So many borrowers are frustrated with the federal student loan system, and they're frustrated with it in part because they may be making on-time payments every single month. They may be making payments that they're required to make, meaning they're making the full payment that, is on their student loan bill, yet their balance continues to grow month after month after month. And so year after year, they look at their balance and they get frustrated that they're doing what we told them to do, what the system told them to do, yet they're not making any progress towards paying down their balance, right? And that's because oftentimes income-driven repayment plans are not really intended for you to pay off the balance. It's really intended for you to buy time until you get loan forgiveness. And the reason for that is because you're not making high enough payments to cover oftentimes even the interest, let alone the principal, right? So you have this concept known as negative amortization, and borrowers never get out from below it oftentimes. And so with this new interest subsidy and principal matching payment, so long as you are making on-time payments in the RAP plan, you will always see your balance go down. That is a game changer, and it is the first time a lawful repayment plan will be able to offer that opportunity. Yes, it's true. The SAVE plan had a very similar sort of negative amortization net, but again, that was an unlawful plan. So this is the first time that Congress has authorized this type of benefit, which will be a game changer to millions of students. At the same time, the tiered standard plan is different than the current standard plan. So your borrowers may sort of recognize that your tiered standard plan is the plan that you get kind of thrown into, once you graduate, and 6 months later, if you don't do anything, that's the one that your servicer is going to, apply for you. And it's a 10-year plan. Now, what will happen is because it's tiered, there will be multiple sort of buckets that borrowers can fall into based upon the size of your balance, your starting balance. So if you have a low balance, you might have 10 years. If you have a really high balance, you might have 25 years. And so that will allow your average borrower to make lower payments if their balance is higher. And so that's also never been afforded to borrowers before. So if you have an individual who graduates and they graduated with like a lot of debt because they got a graduate degree, it may make more sense for them to have longer repayment terms than just your sort of standard 10-year note. So both of those repayment plans are going to provide really affordable opportunities for borrowers starting on July 1.
I do think that there is a lot of interest in RAP because of that interest subsidy, which means if you enroll in the plan and you make your full payment every month like you're supposed to, your loan balance will never be higher than the day you enroll. It just can't happen. And then when you combine it with the principal matching subsidy that you didn't quite touch on, you actually will see your balance potentially decrease every single month. And I think that idea of forward progress is huge because in doing this for almost 20 years, the idea of these ballooning loan balances has been a huge frustration for student loan borrowers over the years.
I think, Robert, like mentally, right? That's important to borrowers. Like if you
Yeah.
open up your bill each month, you want to see a lower balance than the month before, right? So I understand borrowers' frustration, oftentimes confusion, sometimes, really thinking that the system is working against them as opposed to working with them. And under, the president's leadership and Republicans in Congress, these two new repayment plans, I think, will be a game changer for federal student loan borrowers.
I think they definitely move in the right direction for borrowers that are looking to make progress on their loans, but need a plan based on their income versus an amortized plan like the standard plan, which still exists, and you have that option over there. Let's turn our attention to borrowing because repayment is a whole thing, but we also have massive changes coming on the borrowing side of the equation, especially when it comes to new graduate student loan borrowing limits, new Parent Plus loan borrowing limits. This is the first time that these cohorts of borrowers have ever faced loan limits. And the one kind of thing I've said is that I think borrowers should look at this as a stop sign. here's the government telling you, stop. Maybe you shouldn't borrow as much as you've been borrowing, because there might be a problem here. And in doing this for so long, I've consistently said master's degrees in graduate school, it's risky. I don't think people typically view higher education as a risk, but we like to put the investment hat on here at the College Investor. And education is an investment, and investments have risk. And while it might be less risky than other forms of investment, it's not risk free. And I do think that these stop signs are big. So kind of let's go behind the scenes and talk about these new borrowing limits and what that means for upcoming families starting July 1st.
Yeah, and Robert, I agree with you. Like, not all institutions and programs are created equal. And certainly some programs provide a real value for students and families and taxpayers, and some are real duds. And it's really important to understand the differences between the two and how you can make an informed decision. And thanks for all your work on trying to help borrowers do that. So I think that there are a lot of changes coming with regard to how much borrowers can take out starting on July 1st. But in addition, some really important tools that institutions will have for the very first time at their disposal. So before I talk about sort of graduate lending, let me just take a moment and talk about lending in general. So for years, financial aid professionals have been able to counsel borrowers more on a one by one or individualized basis on taking out federal student loans. And that's a concept called professional judgment for the financial aid professionals who are out there listening. But it really was done on an individualized basis. It couldn't have been done in groups. And under the Working Families Tax Cuts Act, it gives financial aid administrators a tool that they've been asking for years, which is how can they make decisions about capping how much a group of borrowers can take out, so long as that group isn't defined by protected characteristics like race or gender, but it's protected based upon the type of program it is. So, for example, you may not want students in a medical assisting program or an English literature program taking on huge amounts of debt. And so the institution can make a decision based upon the types of programs. Maybe they look at the earnings of those graduates, maybe they look at the default rates, and they decide, that they're going to put some institutional limits on that. And so that came out of the Working Families Tax Cuts Act, and I think is a tool that isn't getting as much attention as it deserves. But certainly on the graduate level borrowing, that's where we've seen, I think, the most noise over the last year. So as your listeners may know, in 2006, so not too long ago, the wheels came off the wagon and the federal government allowed graduate students to borrow what we call up to the cost of attendance. And the cost of attendance is set by, guess who? Institutions. And so institutions can really charge whatever they think that consumers will buy. And so we've always had this joke in higher education that you could have $1 million law degree programs and you could take $1 million out in federal student aid. And there are some real extreme examples out there. So in 2006, the wheels came off the wagon. And what we have seen over the course of the last 2 decades is graduate borrowing grow. Right. And what we've also seen is the proliferation of graduate programs, both at the master's degree, but also at the doctoral program, that are really not great value for as much as they're charging. You'll hear about, journalism programs at this school or sociology programs at that school. And don't come for me. Don't write me. I think there are great sociology programs. There are great journalism programs, but, they don't need to cost $150,000 on average. Right. So save your hate mail if you're listening. And so what the federal government did is they stepped in the Working Families Tax Cuts Act, and they said, listen, unlimited graduate lending is ridiculous. We're saddling way too many students with unmanageable debt. They're never able to repay this debt. A lot of times they're not earning wages commensurate with this debt. And we need to get borrowing under control. We need to make sure that the American taxpayer, your average American taxpayer, lives within their means, and colleges and universities have to live within their means. And we're going to stop this cash cow from flowing to institutions. And so some very manageable loan limits are going into effect on July 1. And for the most part, most graduate programs will still have access to $100,000 in graduate loan debt. That's a lot of money for your average borrower. That's a lot of money to pay back, right? And then there will be a few programs like law, medicine, and a few others that'll get slightly higher limits at the $200,000 aggregate loan limit, right? And then there's annual loan limits and there's aggregate loan limits, but that's basically how most people think about it. 100,000 for one pot of programs, 200,000 for another pot of programs. And I think that, again, the Trump administration's view here is the whole purpose of these loan limits is to put downward pressure on institutions to lower the cost of attendance, to lower the cost of higher education. And we are already seeing, Robert, like real evidence of that. Purdue has made announcements that they have reduced the cost of certain graduate level programs. The University of California at Irvine, institutions are offering institutional scholarships. Santa Clara Law School is offering an institutional scholarship. So we are actually seeing real, not anecdotal. These are institutions that oftentimes, point to the Working Families Tax Cuts Act and says, because of this, we are reducing the cost of these programs. We have seen a lot over the last couple of months, and we anticipate seeing a whole lot more in the months to come.
What I found interesting is I know there has been some pushback on what degrees are designated professional and what degrees are designated graduate. And I also do think that some people are applying the English language definitions to those words, professional and graduate, versus the fact that they're policy labels. But I did find interesting that, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the negotiated rulemaking, all of the groups kind of agreed to these limits, which these stakeholders included schools and taxpayers and all sorts of different groups. Am I right in that?
That's exactly right, Robert. So a couple thoughts here. One, I always like to clarify in every forum that I'm given the opportunity to speak at that, yes, the upward bound load caps are for programs that are designated as professional. Professional meaning this sort of very technical definition of what program constitutes one that would receive or have access to these higher loan caps. By no means is it a value judgment. So just because a program does not necessarily get classified as professional under the department's final regulations doesn't mean that we don't believe that, people who are in that program are professionals. We think that nurses are professionals. We think that firefighters are professionals. We think that, police officers and accountants are professionals. But we care about those professions so much that we do not want to saddle those borrowers with unmanageable debt. So by no means is us not designating a program as not professional mean that we think any different of those professions, and people who are in those professions should not think any different of themselves. It really is a technical definition that we are using. And Robert, you absolutely hit the nail on the head. When the department goes through rulemaking, the department does rulemaking, as you may know, very different than most federal agencies. We have to bring stakeholders into the department. We literally sit them around a big table. Sometimes there's 15, 17, 20 outside stakeholder groups. These are people who represent accrediting agencies and states and institutions and consumer advocates and taxpayer advocates and veterans advocates. And by no means do all of these people agree with everything that the Trump administration does. I've heard that, the Trump administration likes to stack the deck on these committees. That's far from the truth, or you can listen back on the negotiated rulemaking. There's certainly people who disagree with many of the decisions that we made. But one of the consensus points here was what constitutes a professional program for technical purposes and what constitutes a graduate program. And this committee, made up of a wide variety of stakeholders, reached 100% agreement on which programs would be classified as professional for this very technical purpose. So, the community, the regulated community and taxpayers, agreed on what they believe this definition should be. And so we are ready to go on July 1st to implement these new loan caps.
I guess the other thing that I do hear, and you came from the accreditation world, I think, and what about these state agencies that might require certain fields to have graduate degrees, but they don't pay off. Do you see a future where these kind of things can change, or maybe they need to reevaluate what some of the value sets are here?
Absolutely, Robert. And, we've done a lot of rulemaking since I was confirmed. We did rulemaking on student loan caps. We did rulemaking on, the new workforce Pell Grant program. We did rulemaking on accountability. Some of those things we already discussed. One of the things we didn't discuss is our rulemaking on accreditation. And that's where we're tackling some of the challenges that you just brought up, right? Like degree inflation is a huge issue in higher education. It's in part a huge issue because institutions obviously continue to, gather revenue for these higher level credentials. A lot of the times, unfortunately, we see that professional associations are sort of in bed with these recognized accrediting agencies where, the professional associations that are attached to them are saying, hey, wink, wink, we really think that this should be a master's degree program instead of a bachelor's degree program. Or, hey, we really think that instead of it being a master's degree program, it should be a doctoral program. Like, what does that do? It adds a whole lot of debt. And what we were seeing is that oftentimes it's not because of safety. It's not because, these borrowers need extra education. It's because it's lining the pockets of institutions. It's lining the pockets of professional trade associations. And accreditors also benefit because they often get paid based upon the number of programs that they accredit. So it's really benefiting everybody except our most important constituent, and that's students.
That's great to hear because I do think that has been a big worry. I don't want to keep you for too much. I've already taken a bunch of your time, but if a borrower is listening to this and they're seeing this July 1st deadline coming, what should a borrower do right now to be ready for July 1st?
I think one, we want borrowers to make sure that their servicer has the most up-to-date information possible. So phone number, email address, borrowers should reach out to their servicer to make sure that they can stay in contact with them. Servicers, are responsible for being the face of federal student aid and making sure that borrowers have all of the supports and tools necessary. So it's really important for borrowers to have their information updated. It's also important for borrowers to understand what's coming down the pike. Again, we have 2 new affordable repayment plans that are starting on July 1. Start doing your homework. Start looking up articles. Start asking your servicer about these potential options. We'll have more information up on federalstudentaid.gov in the coming weeks, and those plans will be ready on July 1. But I think what I would tell a borrower is this. Listen, as a low-income first-generation student who also took out loans, I understand your frustration. The federal student aid system has been overly complex, and it is frustrating for millions of borrowers. I, too, was one of those borrowers. But the changes that we are making starting on July 1 are a game changer. Under this administration, broad student loan forgiveness is not going to happen. Borrowers are responsible for paying off the debts that they took out. It is unfair to ask somebody who never went to college or who went to college and paid off their own debts to saddle them with somebody else's debt is just unfair, right? And folks in the last election sort of made that very clear that they were not okay with that type of approach. And so borrowers need to realize that they have an obligation. They also need to realize that it is of no benefit from them to be in default. It is hurting their credit. It's really impacting their ability to buy a house. It's impacting their ability to rent a car. It's impacting their ability to, engage in real family formation. A defaulted loan is not good for anybody, a borrower or the taxpayer. It's also not good for the institution of higher education as well. So we all need to be working collectively together to get borrowers back into a good place. But borrowers should realize that they shouldn't hold out for broad student loan forgiveness. It's not going to happen. And to get back into lawful repayment. And there are new tools and options available to borrowers that they should take advantage of.
So, where can they find these new tools, and what can borrowers expect when they run them through?
So studentaid.gov is your new best friend, borrowers. So visit studentaid.gov, bookmark it on your computer, bookmark it on your phone, bookmark it on your iPad, and we we want to make sure that you have as much information as possible to make informed decisions. But come July 1, there's a lot of exciting things that are happening in the student loan system. So we're going to make both borrowing and repayment. Robert, that's sort of where we started this conversation, talking about sort of two work streams here, both borrowing and repayment. It's going to get a lot easier. It's going to get a lot more affordable and a lot less complex. So we're going to move from a patchwork system or a Frankenstein model to one that's more streamlined and borrower friendly.
I really am looking forward to these rollouts, and I appreciate the work you're doing to help borrowers and communicate with them. Mr. Undersecretary, I appreciate you taking the time and spending it here with us and sharing your knowledge with us and everyone listening. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks for everything that you are doing and all of the information that your borrowers are getting from this awesome podcast.